heideggerian terminology, aletheia, apophantic, being in the world, being toward death, being with, care or concern, clearing, destruction, Dasein, disclosure, discourse, equipment, Ereignis, existence, existentiell, fundamental ontology, Gelassenheit, Geworfenheit, Geire, metontology, ontic, ontological, ontological difference, possibility, present at hand, ready to hand, resoluteness, Seinsvergleisenheit, the one, the they, world, terms, aletheia. Heidegger's idea of aletheia, or disclosure, Erschlossenheit, was an attempt to make sense of how things in the world appear to human beings as part of an opening in intelligibility, as unclosedness or unconcealedness. This is Heidegger's usual reading of aletheia as Unverborgenheit, unconcealment. It is closely related to the notion of world disclosure, the way in which things get their sense as part of a holistically structured, pre-interpreted background of meaning. Initially, Heidegger wanted aletheia to stand for a reinterpreted definition of truth. However, he later corrected the association of aletheia with truth. Apophantic, German Apophantisch, an assertion as opposed to a question, a doubt, or a more expressive sense, is apophantic. It is a statement that covers up meaning and instead gives something present at hand. For instance, the president is on vacation, and salt is sodium chloride are sentences that, because of their apophantic character, can easily be picked up and repeated in news and gossip by the they. However, the real ready-to-hand meaning and context may be lost. Being in the world, German in der Welt sein. Being in the world is Heidegger's replacement for terms such as subject, object, consciousness, and world. For him, the split of things into subject-object, as is found in the Western tradition and even in language, must be overcome, as is indicated by the root structure of Husserl and Brentano's concept of intentionality, i.e., that all consciousness is consciousness of something, that there is no consciousness as such, cut off from an object, be it matter of a thought or of a perception, nor are there objects without some consciousness beholding or being involved with them. At the most basic level of being in the world, Heidegger notes that there is always a mood that assails us in humanity's unreflecting devotion to the world. A mood comes neither from the outside nor from the inside, but arises from being in the world. A person may turn away from a mood, but that is only to another mood as part of facticity. Only with a mood is someone permitted to encounter things in the world. Dasein, a co-term for being in the world, has an openness to the world that is constituted by the attunement of a mood or state of mind. As such, Dasein is a thrown projection, Geworfenheit, Entwurf, projecting itself onto the possibilities that lie before it or may be hidden, and interpreting and understanding the world in terms of possibilities. Such projecting has nothing to do with comporting oneself toward a plan that has been thought out. It is not a plan, since Dasein has, as Dasein, already projected itself. Dasein always understands itself in terms of possibilities, as projecting. The understanding of Dasein is its possibilities as possibilities. One can take up the possibilities of the they, self, and merely follow along or make some more authentic understanding. See Hubert Dreyfus' book, Being in the World. Being toward death. Sein zum Tode. Being toward death is not an orientation that brings design closer to its end, in terms of clinical death, but is rather a way of being. Being toward death refers to a process of growing through the world, where a certain foresight guides the design towards gaining an authentic perspective. It is provided by dread of death. In the analysis of time, it is revealed as a threefold condition of being: time, the present, and the notion of the eternal are modes of temporality, which is the way humanity views time. For Heidegger, it is very different from the mistaken view of time as being a linear series of past, present, and future. Instead, he sees it as being an ecstasy, an outside of itself, of futural projections, possibilities, and one's place in history as a part of one's generation. Possibilities, then, are integral to understanding of time. Projects, or thrown projection in the world, are what absorb and direct people. Futurity as a direction toward the future that always contains the past, the has-been, is a primary mode of Dasein's temporality. Death is that possibility, which is the absolute impossibility of Dasein. As such, it cannot be compared to any other kind of ending or running out of something. For example, one's death is not an empirical event. For Heidegger, death is Dasein's own most. It is what illuminates Dasein in its individuality. It is non-relational. Nobody can take one's death away from one or die in one's place, and we cannot understand our own death through the death of other Dasein, and it is not to be outstripped. The not yet of life is always already a part of Dasein. As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die. The threefold condition of death is thus simultaneously one's own most potentiality for being, non-relational, and not to be outstripped. Death is determinate in its inevitability, but an authentic being toward death understands the indeterminate nature of one's own inevitable death. One never knows when or how it is going to come. However, this indeterminacy does not put death in some distant, future, not yet authentic being toward death. Understands one's individual death as always already a part of one. With average, everyday normal discussion of death, all this is concealed. The they self talks about in a fugitive manner, passes it off as something that occurs at some time but is not yet present at hand as an actuality, and hides its character as one's own most possibility, presenting it as belonging to no one in particular. It becomes devalued, redefined as a neutral and mundane aspect of existence that merits no authentic consideration. One dies is interpreted as a fact and comes to mean nobody dies. On the other hand, authenticity takes Dasein out of the they, in part by revealing its place as a part of the they. Heidegger states that authentic being toward death calls Dasein's individual self out of its they self and frees it to reevaluate life from the standpoint of finitude. In so doing, Dasein opens itself up for angst, translated alternately as dread or as anxiety. Angst, as opposed to fear, does not have any distinct object for its dread. It is rather anxious in the face of being in the world in general. That is, It is anxious in the face of Dasign's own self. Angst is a shocking individuation of Dasein, when it realizes that it is not at home in the world, or when it comes face to face with its own uncanny German unheimlich, not homelike, in Dasein's individuation. It is open to hearing the call of conscience, German Gewissensschruf, which comes from Dasein's own self when it wants to be itself. This self is then open to truth, understood as unconcealment, Greek aletheia. In this moment of vision, Dasein understands what is hidden as well as hiddenness itself, indicating Heidegger's regular uniting of opposites, in this case, truth and untruth. Being with, German Mitsein. The term being with refers to an ontological characteristic of the human being, that it is always already with others of its kind. This assertion is to be understood not as a factual statement about an individual, that they are at the most in spatial proximity to one or more other individuals, but rather a statement about the being of every human, that in the structures of its being in the world one finds an implicit reference to other humans, as one could not live without others. Humans have been called by others, not by Heidegger, ultrasocial and obligatorily gregarious. Heidegger, from his phenomenological perspective, calls this feature of human life being with, Mitsein, and says it is essential to being human, classifying it as inauthentic when a person fails to recognize how much and in what ways someone thinks of themselves and how they habitually behave as influenced by our social surroundings. Heidegger classifies it as authentic when someone pays attention to that influence and decides independently whether to go along with it or not. Living entirely without such influence, however, is not an option in the heideggerian view. Care or concern, German Sorge, a fundamental basis of being in the world is, for Heidegger, not matter or spirit, but care. Dasein's facticity is such that its being in the world has always dispersed itself or even split itself up into definite ways of being in. The multiplicity of these is indicated by the following examples, having to do with something, producing something, attending to something and looking after it, making use of something, giving something up and letting it go, undertaking, accomplishing, evincing, interrogating, considering, discussing, determining. All these ways of being and have concern, Sorge, care, as their kind of being. Just as the scientist might investigate or search and presume neutrality, it can be seen that beneath this there is the mood, the concern of scientists to discover, to reveal new ideas or theories, and to attempt to level off temporal aspects. Clearing, Lichtung. In German, the word Lichtung means a clearing, as in, for example, a clearing in the woods. Since its root is the German word for light, Licht, it is sometimes also translated as lighting, and in Heidegger's work, it refers to the necessity of a clearing in which anything at all can appear, the clearing in which something or idea can show itself or be unconcealed. Note the relation that this has to aletheia. See the main article or the entry above, and disclosure. Beings, Seiendes, but not being itself, Sein, stands out as if in a clearing, or physically, as if in a space. Thus, Hubert Dreyfus writes, things show up in the light of our understanding of being. Thus, the clearing makes possible the disclosure of beings, Seiendes, and also access to Dasein's own being. The clearing is not, itself, an entity that can be known directly, in the sense in which know about entities of the world. As Heidegger writes on the origin of the work of art, in the midst of being as a whole an open place occurs, there is a clearing, a lighting, thought of in reference to what is, to beings. This clearing is in a greater degree than our beings. This open center is therefore not surrounded by what is, rather, the lighting center itself encircles all that is, like nothing which we scarcely know. That which is can only be, as a being, if it stands within and stands out within what is lighted in this clearing. Only this clearing grants and guarantees to us humans a passage to those beings that we ourselves are not, and access to the being that we ourselves are. Destruction. Founded in the work of Martin Luther, Heidegger conceptualizes philosophy as the task of destroying ontological concepts, including ordinary everyday meanings of words like time, history, being, theory, death, mind, body, matter, logic, etc. When tradition thus becomes master, it does so in such a way that what it transmits is made so inaccessible, proximally and for the most part, that it rather becomes concealed. Tradition takes what has come down to us and delivers it over to self-evidence. It blocks our access to those primordial sources from which the categories and concepts handed down to us have been in part quite genuinely drawn. Indeed, it makes us forget that they have had such an origin, and makes us suppose that the necessity of going back to these sources is something which we need not even understand. Being in Time, page 43. Heidegger considers that tradition can become calcified here and there. If the question of being is to have its own history made transparent, then this hardened tradition must be loosened up, and the concealments which it has brought about dissolved. We understand this task as one in which, by taking the question of being as our clue, we are to destroy the traditional content of ancient ontology until we arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the nature of being, the ways which have guided us ever since. Being in Time, page 44. Heidegger then remarks on the positivity of his project of destruction. It has nothing to do with the vicious relativizing of ontological standpoints, but this destruction is just as far from having the negative sense of shaking off the ontological tradition. We must, on the contrary, stake out the positive possibilities of that tradition, and this means keeping it within its limits. And these, in turn, are given factically in the way the question is formulated at the time, and in the way the possible fields for investigation is thus bounded off. On its negative side, this destruction does not relate itself toward the past. Its criticism is aimed at today, and at the prevalent way of treating the history of ontology. But to bury the past in nullity, Nichtigkeit, is not the purpose of this destruction. Its aim is positive. Its negative function remains unexpressed and indirect. Being in Time, page 44. Dasein. In his effort to redefine man, Heidegger introduces a statement: the ownmost of Dasein consists in its existence. Heidegger conceptualizes existence around the unique qualities of man, which he considers its own being as an issue for it. In the heideggerian view, man defines its own being through its actions and choices, and is able to choose amongst possibilities, actualizing at least one of the possibilities available while closing off others in the process. This grasping of only some possibilities defines man as one kind of self rather than another. A dishonest choice defines a person as dishonest. Fixing broken windows defines a person as a glacier, and so on. These choices are made continually and on a daily basis. And so man is able to define itself as it moves along. Therefore, living the life of a person is a matter of constantly taking a stand on one's sense of self, and one's sense of self being defined by taking that stand. As no choice is once and for always, man has to continually keep on choosing for his sense of self. Added to this is that the being of everything else on the planet poses an issue for man, as humanity deals with things as what they are and persons as who they are. Only persons, for example, relate to others as meaningful and fitting meaningfully into and with other things and or activities. Only man, being that is in the manner of existence, can encounter another entity in its instrumental character. Again, to be an issue means to be concerned about something and to care for something. In other words, being of Dasein as existence is so constituted that in its very being it has a caring relationship to its own being. This relationship is not a theoretical or self-reflective one, but rather a pre-theoretical one, which Heidegger calls a relation or compartment of understanding. Dasein understands itself in its own being, or Dasein is in the manner that its being is always disclosed to it. It is this disclosure of being that differentiates Dasein from all other beings. This manner of being of Dasein to which it relates or comports itself is called existence. Further, it is essential to have a clear understanding of the term Ohnmost. It is the English rendering of the German Wesen, translated usually as essence, the whatness. The verbal form of German term Wesen comes closer to the Indian root vasate, which means dwelling, living, growing, maturing, moving, etc. Thus, this verbal dynamic character implied in the word Wesen is to be kept in mind to understand the nuance of the heideggerian usage of existence. If traditionally Wesen had been translated as essence in the sense of whatness, for Heidegger such a translation is unfit to understand what is uniquely human. Heidegger takes the form of existence from the Latin word existere, to stand out of itself, with an indication of the unique characteristic of the being of man in terms of a dynamic how, as against the traditional conception in terms of whatness. Hence, existence for Heidegger means how Dasein, its very way of being, is always outside itself in a relationship of relating, caring as opposed to a relationship of cognitive understanding to other inwardly beings. Thereby it is thereby it is to differentiate strictly what is ownmost to Dasein from that of other modes of beings that Heidegger uses the term existence for the being of man. For what is ownmost to other modes of beings, he uses the term present at hand. The various elements of existence are called existentials, and that of what is present at hand are called the categories. According to Heidegger, man alone exists. All other things they don't exist. It is important to understand that this notion of existence as what is ownmost to man is not a static concept to be defined once and for all in terms of a content, but has to be understood in terms of something that is to be enacted, that varies from individual to individual and from time to time, unlike other beings that have a fixed essence. The being whose own most is in the manner of existence is called Dasein. In German, da has a spatial connotation of either being there or here. Dasein, thus, can mean simply being there or here. In German, it could also refer to the existence as opposed to the essence of something, especially that of man. However, Heidegger invests this term with a new ontological meaning. The German term Dasein consists of two components, da and sein. In the Heideggerian usage, the suffix sein stands for the being of man in the manner of existence, and da stands for a threefold disclosure. According to Heidegger, the being of man is in the manner of a threefold disclosure. That is, the ontological uniqueness of man consists in the fact that its being becomes the sphere, where not only its own being, but the being of other non-human beings, as well as the phenomenon of world, is disclosed to Dasein, because of which it can encounter the inner-worldly beings and their worlding character. Hence, for Heidegger, the term Dasein is a title for the ontological structure of the ontical human being. Disclosure, German Erschlossenheit. Hubert Dreyfus and Charles Spinoza write that, according to Heidegger, our nature is to be world disclosers. That is, by means of our equipment and coordinated practices, we human beings open coherent, distinct contexts or worlds in which we perceive, feel, act, and think. Heidegger scholar Nicholas Gombrowicz writes, world disclosure refers, with deliberate ambiguity, to a process which actually occurs at two different levels. At one level, it refers to the disclosure of an already interpreted, symbolically structured world, the world, that is, within which we always already find ourselves. At another level, it refers as much to the disclosure of new horizons of meaning as to the disclosure of previously hidden or unthematized dimensions of meaning. Discourse, German, Rede. The ontological existential structure of Dasein consists of throwness, Geworfenheit, projection, Entwurf, and being along with engagement, Sein bei. These three basic features of existence are inseparably bound to discourse, Rede, understood as the deepest unfolding of language. Equipment, German, das Zug. Das Zug refers to an object in the world with which one has meaningful dealings. A nearly untranslatable term, Heidegger's equipment can be thought of as a collective noun, so that it is never appropriate to call something an equipment. Instead, its use often reflects it to mean a tool, or as in order to, for Dasein. Tools, in this collective sense, and in being ready to hand, always exist in a network of other tools and organizations, e.g., the paper is on a desk in a room at a university. It is inappropriate usually to see such equipment on its own or as something present at hand. Another, less prosaic, way of thinking of equipment is as stuff one can work with, around us, along with its context. The paper one can do things with, from the desk, in the university, in the city, on the world, in the universe. Equipment refers to the thing and its usefulness, possibilities, and its context. Ereignis. Ereignis is translated often as an event, but is better understood in terms of something coming into view. It comes from the German prefix "er", comparable to "re" in English, and "auge", I. It is a noun coming from a reflexive verb. Note that the German prefix "er" also can connote an end or a fatality. A recent translation of the word by Kenneth Malley and Parvis Ahmad renders the word as inong, that in connection with things that arise and appear, that they are arising into their own. Hubert Dreyfus defined the term as things coming into themselves by belonging together. Eragnis appears in Heidegger's later works and is not easily summarized. The most sustained treatment of the theme occurs in the cryptic and difficult contributions to philosophy. In the following quotation, he associates it with the fundamental idea of concern from being in time. The English etymology of concern is similar to that of the German. We must return to what we call a concern. The word Eragnis concern has been lifted from organically developing language. Eigen to concern means originally to distinguish or discern which one's eyes see, and in seeing calling to oneself appropriate. The word concern we shall now harness as a theme word in the service of thought. Existence, existential, fundamental ontology. Traditional ontology asks, why is there anything? Whereas Heidegger's fundamental ontology asks, what does it mean for something to be? Taylor Carman writes 2003 that Heidegger's fundamental ontology is fundamental relative to traditional ontology in that it concerns what any understanding of entities necessarily presupposes, namely, our understanding of that in virtue of which entities are entities. Gelassenheit. For the understanding of Gelassenheit in the Anabaptist tradition, see Ordnung and Gelassenheit, often translated as releasement, Heidegger's concept of Gelassenheit has been explained as the spirit of disponibility, availability, before what is, which permits us simply to let things be in whatever may be their uncertainty and their mystery. Heidegger elaborated the idea of Gelassenheit in 1959 with a homonymous volume which includes two texts, a 1955 talk entitled simply Gelassenheit, and a conversation, Gespräch, entitled Zur Erörterung der Gelassenheit aus einem Feldweggesprach über das Denken, towards an explication of Gelassenheit, from a conversation on a country path about thinking, or toward an emplacing discussion, Erörterung, of releasement, Gelassenheit, from a country path, conversation about thinking. An English translation of this text was published in 1966 as Conversation on a Country Path About Thinking. Heidegger borrowed the term from the Christian mystical tradition, proximately from Meister Eckhart. Geworfenheit. Geworfenheit describes man's individual existence as being thrown, geworfen, into the world. For William J. Richardson, Heidegger used this single term, thrownness, to describe the two elements of the original situation, their being's non-mastery of its own origin and its referential dependence on other things. Geiche, or the term die Geiche, is a term rarely used by Heidegger, but employed commentators who refer to a change in his writings as early as 1930 that became clearly established by the 1940s. Recurring themes that characterize much of the Geiche include poetry and technology. Commentators, e.g., William J. Richardson describe variously a shift of focus or a major change in outlook. The 1935 introduction to metaphysics clearly shows the shift to language from a previous emphasis on design and being in time 8 years earlier, according to Brian Bard's 1993 essay titled Heidegger's Reading of Heraclitus. In a 1950 lecture, Heidegger formulated the famous saying, "Language speaks," later published in the 1959 essays collection Unterwegs zur Sprache, and collected in the 1971 English book Poetry, Language, Thought. This supposed shift, applied here to cover about 30 years of Heidegger's 40-year writing career, has been described by commentators from widely varied viewpoints, including as a shift in priority from being in time to time and being, namely, from dwelling being in the world to doing time in the world. This aspect, in particular, the 1951 essay, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, influenced several notable architectural theorists, including Christian Norbert Schulz, Dalibor Vesely, Joseph Reichwert, Daniel Libeskind, and the philosopher-architect Nader el-Bisri. Other interpreters believe the Caire does not exist or is overstated in its significance. Thomas Sheehan, 2001, believes this supposed change is far less dramatic than usually suggested and entailed a change in focus and method. Sheehan contends that throughout his career, Heidegger never focused on being, but rather tried to define that which brings about being as a giveness of entities. Mark Rothall argued 2011 that the Caire is not found in Heidegger's writings, but is simply a misconception. As evidence for this view, Rothall sees a consistency of purpose in Heidegger's lifelong pursuit and refinement of his notion of unconcealment. Among the notable works dating after 1934 are Building, Dwelling, Thinking, 1951, and The Question Concerning Technology, 1954, The Origin of the Work of Art, 1935, Contributions to Philosophy from Enoning, composed in the years 1936 to 38, but not published until 1989, and On the Essence of Truth, 1930, and what is called Thinking, 1954. Also, during this period, Heidegger wrote extensively on Nietzsche and the poet Hölderlin. Metontology. Metontology is a neologism Heidegger introduced in his 1928 lecture course Metaphysical Foundations of Logic. The term refers to the ontic sphere of human experience, while ontology deals with the entire world in broad and abstract terms. Metontology concerns concrete topics. Heidegger offers the examples of sexual differences and ethics. Ontic, untisch, German. Heidegger uses the term ontic, often in contrast to the term ontological, when he gives descriptive characteristics of a particular thing and the plain facts of its existence. What is ontic is what makes something what it is. For an individual discussing the nature of being, one's ontic could refer to the physical, factual elements that produce and or underlie one's own reality. The physical brain and its substructures. Moralists raise the question of a moral ontic when discussing whether there exists an external, objective, independent source of wellspring for morality that transcends culture and time. Ontological, ontologisch. As opposed to ontic, untisch, ontological is used when the nature or meaningful structure of existence is at issue. Ontology, a discipline of philosophy, focuses on the formal study of being. Thus, something that is ontological is concerned with understanding and investigating being, the ground of being, or the concept of being itself. For an individual discussing the nature of being, The ontological could refer to one's own first-person, subjective, phenomenological experience of being. Ontological difference. Central to Heidegger's philosophy is the difference between being as such and specific entities. He calls this the ontological difference and accuses the Western tradition in philosophy of being forgetful of this distinction, which has led to misunderstanding being as such as a distinct entity. See Reification. Possibility, German, Möglichkeit. Möglichkeit is a term used only once in a particular edition of Being and Time. In the text, the term appears to denote the possibility whose probability it is solely to be possible. At least, if it were used in context, this is the only plausible definition. Present at hand, German, vorhanden, Vorhandenheit. With the present at hand, one has, in contrast to ready to hand, an attitude like that of a scientist or theorist, of merely looking at or observing something. In seeing an entity as present at hand, the beholder is concerned only with the bare facts of a thing or a concept, as they are present and in order to theorize about it. This way of seeing is disinterested in the concern it may hold for design, its history, or usefulness. This attitude is often described as existing in neutral space without any particular mood or subjectivity. However, for Heidegger, it is not completely disinterested or neutral. It has a mood, and is part of the metaphysics of presence that tends to level all things down. Through his writings, Heidegger sets out to accomplish the destruction, see above, of this metaphysics of presence. Presence at hand is not the way things in the world are usually encountered, and it is only revealed as a deficient or secondary mode, e.g., when a hammer breaks it loses its usefulness and appears as merely there, present at hand. When a thing is revealed as present at hand, it stands apart from any useful set of equipment, but soon loses this mode of being present at hand and becomes something, for example, that must be repaired or replaced. Ready to hand. German, griffbereit, Zuhandenheit. In almost all cases, humanity is involved in the world in an ordinary and more involved way, undertaking tasks with a view to achieving something. Take, for example, a hammer. It is ready to hand. We use it without theorizing. In fact, if we were to look at it as present at hand, we might easily make a mistake. Only when it breaks or something goes wrong might we see the hammer as present at hand, just lying there. Even then, however, it may not be fully present at hand, as it is now showing itself as something to be repaired or disposed, and therefore a part of the totality of our involvements. In this case, its being may be seen as unreadiness to hand. Heidegger outlines three manners of unreadiness to hand: conspicuous, damaged, e.g., a lamp's wiring has broken; obtrusive, a part is missing which is required for the entity to function, e.g., we find the bulb is missing; obstinate, when the entity is a hindrance to us in pursuing a project, e.g., the lamp blocks my view of the computer screen. Importantly, the ready to hand only emerges from the prior attitude in which we care about what is going on and we see the hammer in a context or world of equipment that is handy or remote, and that is there in order to do something. In this sense, the ready to hand is primordial compared to that of the present at hand. The term primordial here does not imply something primitive, but rather refers to Heidegger's idea that being can only be understood through what is everyday and close to us. Our everyday understanding of the world is necessarily a part of any kind of scientific theoretical studies of entities. The present at hand might be Only by studying our average everyday understanding of the world as it is expressed in the totality of our relationships to the ready-to-hand entities of the world can we lay appropriate bases for specific scientific investigations into specific entities within the world. For Heidegger and being in time, this illustrates in a very practical way the way the present at hand as a present in a now or a present eternally, as for example, a scientific law or a Platonic form, has come to dominate intellectual thought, especially since the Enlightenment. To understand the question of being, one must be careful not to fall into this leveling off or forgetfulness of being that has come to assail Western thought since Socrates. See the metaphysics of presence. Resoluteness, Entschlossenheit. Resoluteness refers to one's ability to unclose one's framework of intelligibility, i.e., to make sense of one's words and actions in terms of one's life as a whole, and the ability to be receptive to the call of conscience. Seinvergessenheit. This is translated variously as forgetting of being, or oblivion of being. A closely related term is Seinvergelassenheit, translated as abandonment of being. Heidegger believed that a pervasive nihilism in the modern world stems from Seinvergelassenheit, the ontological difference. The distinction between being as such, das Sein, and beings, das Seiende, is fundamental for Heidegger. The forgetfulness of being that, according to him, occurs in the course of Western philosophy amounts to the oblivion of this distinction. The one, the they. German, das Mann, meaning they self. See also problem of universals. One of the most interesting and important concepts in being in time is that of das Mann, for which there is no exact English translation. Different translations and commentators use different conventions. It is often translated as the they, or people, or anyone, but is more accurately translated as one, as in one should always arrive on time. John Patočka denoted for the concept das Mann a synonymous designation, public anonymous. Das Mann derives from the impersonal singular pronoun man, one, as distinct from I, or you, or he, or she, or they. Both the German man and the English one are neutral or indeterminate in respect of gender and even, in a sense, of number, though both words suggest an unspecifiable, indeterminate plurality. The semantic role of the word man in German is nearly identical to that of the word one in English. Heidegger refers to this concept of the one in explaining inauthentic modes of existence, in which Dasein, instead of truly choosing to do something, does it only because that is what one does, or that is what people do. Thus, das Mann is not a proper or measurable entity, but rather an amorphous part of social reality that functions effectively in the manner that it does through this intangibility. Das Mann constitutes a possibility of das Sein's being, and so das Mann cannot be said to be any particular someone. Rather, the existence of the they is known to us through, for example, linguistic conventions and social norms. Heidegger states that the they prescribes one's state of mind and determines what and how one sees. To give examples, when one makes an appeal to what is commonly known, one says one does not do such a thing, When one sits in a car or bus or reads a newspaper, one is participating in the world of the they. This is a feature of the they as it functions in society, an authority that has no particular source. In a non-moral sense, Heidegger contrasts the authentic self, my owned self, with the they self, my unowned self. A related concept to this is that of apophantic assertion. World, German, Welt. Further information, world disclosure. Heidegger gives us 4 ways of using the term world. 1. World is used as an ontical concept and signifies the totality of things which can be present at hand within the world. 2. World functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those things we have just mentioned. And indeed, world can become a term for any realm which encompasses a multiplicity of entities. For instance, when one talks of the world of a mathematician, world signifies the realm of possible objects of mathematics. 3. World can be understood in another ontical sense, not, however, as those entities which Dasein essentially is not and which can be encountered within the world, but rather as the wherein of factical Dasein as such can be said to live. World has here a pre-ontological existential signification. Here again there are different possibilities. World may stand for the public, we world, or one's own closest domestic environment. 4. Finally, world designates the ontologico-existential concept of worldhood, Weltheit. Worldhood itself may have as its modes whatever structural holes any special worlds may have at the time, but it embraces in itself the a priori character of worldhood in general. Note, it is the third definition that Heidegger normally uses.